Hello everyone. Hello and welcome once again to the Lunar Denizens. So thanks for joining our final trip to, actually, it's not our final trip to Mare Nectaris, it's rather the trip from Mare Nectaris to back to Earth. So if you've missed the previous session, obviously they've all been, as Nick said, they've all been recorded and they've also been uploaded to NSPDOS YouTube channel. And like every session, I highly recommend everyone to go checking these recordings because for me at least, they've been very, very inspiring. And also they've been very kind of informative. And we also had a great collection of guests. And as Nick mentioned, we also had a very kind of like dynamic chat that kept the conversation very open and very fluid. So yeah, again, I just want to reiterate, don't hesitate to sort of like share comments, links, and really think about this session as a kind of more of an open conversation with our guest panelists actually as the catalysts for this conversation. For those of you who are actually new to these events, we are, as Nick mentioned again, we are co-organizing these events with the Center for Institute Interplanetary Project and NSPDOS. My name is Sitraka Rakotoniaina, and together with Andrew, friend, who doesn't have his camera on because he's got a problem with it. Here's Andrew.
But I'm here in voice.
Okay, here the spirit of Andrew is with us, and we will be moderating this session as part of our kind of like research project, very, very far away, or VVFA, which is interested in reimagining futures on Earth and beyond, alternate and faraway landscapes built upon objects, systems, rituals, myths, and things. So this is our last event, as I mentioned, but before this last event, we first had our welcoming party where we took our first steps on Mare Nectaris and kind of like learning how to skip around the station, like as a strategy for human locomotion in reduced gravity. We also familiarized ourselves with the environment, the fact that we are on the moon, but constantly enclosed in our space domes, space capsules, and spacesuits. And then our second event, which was the kind of moon life session, we explored what daily life could be like and what moon-specific recreational activities were around for us to try, and trying to characterize this sort of community and imagine for ourselves how it feels to be a denizen from Mare Nectaris, and how this harsh environment would shape the way we live together, and ultimately how this may inform our relationship to this magnificent desolation that is the lunar landscape. And today, after these unique experiences, we are planning our return to Earth. But more than just jumping on board our kind of like imaginary spacecraft and just zip back to Earth, I think we want to take this opportunity to examine the Earth-Moon relationship, not only from a sort of pragmatic standpoint, but also from a cultural perspective and perhaps from a planetary perspective too, and how does it affect, inform, or change our space narratives in a way. So, for instance, is it the first step to our human expansion through the solar system and perhaps to the universe? And if it is, do we keep bringing the same human rules, practices, and problems to extraterrestrial territories? Or on the contrary, is it the opportunity to start reframing our position in relation to other species and environments, whether it is here on Earth, on the moon, or beyond? And also, what does this mean for our human experience? So, amongst the themes related to today's topic that we potentially addressed in previous events, but I still think that are interesting to explore further, there was the idea of designing the space settlement with in mind a certain nostalgia for Earth, or how Mare Nectaris could be seen as some sort of analog, Earth mission or simulation on the moon. We may also want to think about the Earth's perception of lunar denizens. What kind of status do lunar denizens hold in the eyes of the earthbound inhabitants, like those on the moon, but also those who are coming back? And from a lunar denizen's perspective, how do you communicate and share your experience? But also, do we all develop a kind of planetary consciousness that profoundly changes our human culture, Or do we simply look at Mare Nectaris as a gateway to a new frontier? Do we just keep appropriating things? Does the moon belong to Earth like it physically did like some time ago, a very, very long time ago? And the final thing that would be quite interesting to discuss as well, potentially if we get to that point, is also birth and death on another celestial body, and what could this mean for the human species? So, like in our previous sessions, the expectation for this conversation are to try to imagine and describe the built environment that captures the culture and the social dynamic of this community. So let's imagine the objects, the structures, the protocols, the systems associated with Lunar Denizens, and continue to add to what we started, which is a sort of catalog of lunar things that are yet to be imagined. And to help us to do that today, we have with us the actual director of the Santa Fe Institute's Interplanetary Project, Caitlin McShea. Hello. And we also have Charmian Griffin, Julijonas, Urbonas, and Joseph Popper. And I'm going to ask you, the panelists, to actually introduce yourself and just like take 5 minutes to just explain us what's your expertise, what's your interests, and also potentially what's your hope for this conversation. And I will start with Caitlin.
Thank you, Sitraka. And thank you, Sitraka and Nick and NSPDOS for including me in this final event. Actually, I've been privileged enough to help organize the last few, so I'm really happy to get to kind of talk a little bit. As Sitraka said, I am the director of the Santa Fe Institute's Interplanetary Project. I also host a podcast called Alien Crash Site, which is a speculative interview series premised on a science fiction novel called Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. And usually those interviews culminate in a conversation about alien technologies. So a lot of imagination goes into those. And I manage a research grant on complex time, as well as a research grant on origins of life and life detection. So aliens and coordination and timescale issues. And I think the reason that I am here is because, as Sitraka mentioned as a theme in this conversation, I'm very personally interested in communication. I think that we are extremely compelled to communicate our experiences with each other. And by we, I'm talking about humans, but I'm more or less suspecting that that compulsion stretches across most, if not all, of life forms. And even though we want to do it, we are incapable of doing it perfectly. And I'm curious about what happens to meaning the moment that it's mediated in any form, and whether there are better forms for doing it. I'm not sure, but I'm curious to see whether or not this conversation kind of becomes something like a moonshot opportunity to figure out the most effective methods for sharing effectively our experience with each other, and what moon humans and earth humans might have in common and might have lost in the separation. But we'll see. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, look forward to that as well. So I'm going to move on to the next guest, which I'm just going to pick Julijonas Urbonas. Do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yes, hello. I'm Juliana Sorbonnes, a Lithuanian artist, designer, researcher, and the founder of the Lithuanian Space Agency, an institution or organization that researches extraterrestrial culture, cosmic imagination, and gravitational aesthetics. The most recent project of ours is a presentation of a very first Lithuanian space program, which is based on a simple idea to make a new planet from human bodies. And the presentation takes place at the Lithuanian Pavilion in the Venice Architecture Biennale right now. There is still time to visit it, around a month until it would end. And this presentation might be seen as an artistic and scientific feasibility study into what it would be like to make such a planet, and what kind of aesthetic, ethical, political implications it would provoke. And in addition to that, we've got quite a number of smaller projects, smaller scale projects. Some of them are related to extraterrestrial sound. For example, we are working with a largest and heaviest grand piano we could find in Lithuania, which is basically Soviet grand piano, and we are attaching to human centrifuge so that instead of an astronaut or cosmonaut, you would have a grand piano and piano player. And we would see how these kind of altered states of gravity would affect the way the instrument sounds, the way the piano player plays, and the way composition manifests itself under these kind of circumstances. So it could be considered as kind of simulator of extraterrestrial sound. Other projects are related to space culinary or space food. One of them is on the called The Ultimate Moonshine, which might be related to this discussion. It was actually almost happened in a kind of observatory in Edinburgh. We were considering channeling or programming the telescope so that the telescope would follow the moon and would channel the light of the moon into moonshine distillery, into one specific moment when, you know, alcohol is still in steam form, so that that steam would be lit by moon light. So it would be the ultimate moonshine that would be produced in this machine. Also, we're working with Lithuanian astrobotanists. I have to pitch Lithuania a little bit because very few people know that Lithuania is the very first country which managed to grow a plant from seed to seed, full life cycle. And I'm working with those astrobotanists to cultivate specific kind of plants on Earth, making that kind of extraterrestrial simulator for plants here on Earth, and then making vodka from those plants. So this kind of, this is an overview of our current activities that could be considered as national space program. Yeah, well, when it comes to our conversation, I would imagine this as, because it's one of the, is it the last or one of the last ones? I would imagine this as some kind of conversion narrative, because I would imagine somebody who have spent some time in there, up there, they would be transformed into something. So I would imagine our conversation would be about that, about what kind of conversation happened there. And conversation, conversation, or conversion. Okay.
Thank you very much. This so you are, yeah, entertainment officer officially on Mare Nectaris.
well, I used to be a director of a museum park.
Oh, yeah, true.
I spent 5 years running a small amusement park.
So that's brilliant.
Yeah, so yeah.
Okay, moving on. We also have with us Charmian Griffin. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I can't believe you're making me follow you. That's really unfair. Yeah, fair enough. I'm just going to apologize quickly because I have to keep turning my camera on and off because I've just contracted my first cold in years. And I have to keep blowing my nose and it feels really retro. I don't know if you guys remember what it's like to have a cold, but it feels like a kind of journey through history. I'm very interested in this idea that anyone would create a plant specifically that can grow on the moon and then make vodka from it. It seems like such a waste, but anyway, yeah, my interest in the moon, I guess, came about this last year. I'm a digital producer and writer, and I work with lots of different arts organizations and artists to help people produce online art projects, essentially, or net art. And one of the projects I was tasked with this year was there was a garden that was acquired by a group of women in Nelson in Lancashire at the end of 2019 that was supposed to become the UK's first, or maybe Europe's first physic garden built by women for women. So they were going to cultivate the land, plant all these medicinal herbs, like with the local women in the community, and grow them, and in the process, like learn about the healing properties of these herbs, and like kind of reclaim that approach to health. I think we've lost through kind of, scientific methodologies that we use these days. And unfortunately, of course, when the pandemic hit in March, they weren't able to do that. So the garden was left as this like quite depressing, muddy strip of land. And they came to me and said, what can you do to bring these women together? And it's a wide range of women that were going to work on the garden. So, women in their sort of 70s and 80s, some with, very little kind of familiarity with technology. So like that kind of idea of doing Zoom conversations was just out. So I set up a Physic Garden network. We essentially sent seeds to women across the country and a couple outside of the country even, and got them all to grow the garden remotely. And we did that via the lunar cycles. So with each lunar cycle, they were sent a new package. They were, they kind of collaborated together to kind of learn how to grow them. So it wasn't just like a teaching methodology, it was more like sharing knowledge. We also talked about what the different uses of the herbs are. And then each month there was a new sort of artist in residence on the network who would kind of respond to those women and create a new artwork. And I'll share a link in the chat in a moment for the website, which is kind of a work in progress at the moment. So yeah, that's where my very earthbound interest in the moon comes from. And like you, I'm really interested in, so you as in julijonas, I'm really interested in the kind of cultural aspect of the moon and like how people who've been to the moon or who have access to the moon will be kind of, I guess, like perceived back on Earth or like received when they return, which is us today as we return. So yeah, I'm interested to hear from all of you, like, what do you think would happen if this really were to take place?
Thank you very much. That's very fascinating. Definitely fitting with our session today. And our last guest is Joseph Papa. I don't know why I laughed when I was about to say your name. I'm very sorry. Joseph Papa, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here and to be in the company of such fantastic speakers and panelists and guests as well. Yeah, what an honor. So I am an artist and designer, originally from London, with a background in critical and speculative design. I moved to Basel in Switzerland 4 years ago to take part in a art and design based research PhD program, which I'm shortly about to finish. And outer space has been a long-standing interest in my work. And initially, outer space was a place to imagine extraordinary human experiences. For example, one of my projects is called The One-Way Ticket, where I imagined a one-way journey into space and explored the idea of not coming back and what that might mean across a number of different levels. And I tried to represent and communicate this experience on film through a range of different low budget, zero gravity special effects, film sets and other contraptions. And more recently in my research, my interest in imagining outer space has moved into a more of a collective sense. So the idea of the imaginary, a shared vision of the future being a very powerful social force in itself. And my particular concern is a powerful and predominant vision of humankind as a spacefaring civilization, which is very influential in directing large parts of the space industry. And my work of the last few years has been trying to examine what makes this particular imaginary so powerful, but also problematic, and studying the different aesthetic gestures and imagery that make it up. And then also exploring different ways that artists and artistic methods can be a means of engaging with these problematics and also disrupting them and unsettling them in productive ways. So my motivation to be here, I've got a very open mind as to how this conversation will go. I've been following the previous discussions with great interest and enjoyment, and I suppose maybe to kind of give some clue, I think what I'm pleased to find is that there seems to be more and more artists, designers, and also those working in the more social scientists who are taking a real key interest in outer space as a critical site for human futures. And if we seem to be on a trajectory beyond Earth's atmosphere in greater scales, then it's also important that we approach what it means to be spacefaring, if you like, from different perspectives, more diverse perspectives than there maybe are the ones in the foreground at the moment. And I think it's the role of artists, designers, and other cultural producers to play a big part in that. So I think this event very much fits into that framework. And so I'm really pleased to be here and to see where this leads us and where the conversations go into the next VVFA projects.
Well, thank you very much. This is great. And I'm very, very happy you all agreed to participate in this conversation. And it's reminded me a little bit like what Charmian Network was, what you were talking about. Actually, this is a little bit like what these events have been a little bit is like trying to create this kind of library of shared knowledge between us and between the participants of the Lunar Denizens to kind of eventually create new type of conversation or address new interesting potential interesting spaces. Anyway, so to open this conversation, actually, I thought one thing that I'd like to do that is kind of different from the previous session is like I'd like to start with kind of open questions that are very sort of like design sprint like. And this question is obviously like most of the questions, I mean, all these questions, I have like some sort of roadmap that I'll be following as a structure for this conversation, but most of my questions are often very open to everyone on the panel to grab and answer. And also I want to just add the fact that this is not necessarily a conversation with one single narrative or single scenario. I mean, I'm very happy to have multiple layered scenarios that may contradict each other, like different type of reality that are juxtaposing, for instance. And yeah, so again, these questions are open to everyone, and it's just some sort of warm up, and let's see where, I mean, if this question leads us somewhere. So I'm just going to read you a bit of
one thing
oh,
quickly
sorry.
before we get before we get underway, just to reiterate the point that Nick made at the beginning, and Sitraka mentioned that the conversation is also extended to everybody in the chat as well, and all the participants that are here and involved in the conversation. So we'll be monitoring the chat, and if you have questions or points that you want to kind of throw into the conversation, that's totally open, and that's a major part of how these events run as well. So yeah, let's get started.
Cool. Yes. So I'm just going to read my little paragraph here. The shift in scale, routine, and level of freedom could be overwhelming for those used to the rhythm and ritual of the base, or it could be a welcome challenge, yearning for return to a familiar life once lived. Adopt a position of a resident of Mare Nectaris, either before or after departure from the base. Explore the desires, wants, worries, and concerns of this group. Are there systems or protocols in place from previous departees? What are the artifacts, objects, or tools that help with this transition? What are the mementos and souvenirs from this one-off experience? What are they?
Joseph,
Right.
what are you bringing back?
Oh God! All right. Low expectations.
What?
No, I had a quick look at the roadmap beforehand, and I was thinking about this, and I must admit it took me a while to get past the cliches of like moon rocks and postcards. So I was thinking about how if you were to be back on Earth from living on the base, how could you possibly feel connected back to the base that you were once on without physically taking something from it? And this actually ties into Juliana's example of piano. You have to bear with me. But there's a great, one of my favorite moon-based artworks is by an artist called Katie Patterson, who made this work called Moon, Earth, Moon. And, oh no, Earth, Moon, Earth. Anyhow, it's about, she takes a grand piano and she beamed Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata as Morse code from Earth to the moon and back. And the code, of course, as it hits the moon, is distorted by the craters and the rock formations, etc., and comes back with notes missing, distortions, and the code is then reinterpreted back and then played on a piano in a gallery. So it's familiar as Beethoven, but it's not quite Earth Beethoven. And so I was thinking about radio waves and this idea of moon bouncing. And of course, this work depends very much from an earthbound position to the moon and back. But if you're on a denizen on the moon, perhaps you could actually do an earth bounce and kind of create your own radio wave based relation to the moon. And that also relates to another example from history where I think it was in the 40s, the first, I think that was when the first bounce to the moon went back was made by the US Navy or Army. And they were really celebrating that in the 40s as one of the first times that humankind had left the Earth through the medium of radio waves. So maybe it's a piece of music or a piece of kind of moon bounce equipment that you can somehow stay in touch with the moon with in a non-destructive way. So that's my rather roundabout way of starting.
I like the sound of moon bounce as a kind of genre of music. It kind of got a kind of, there's some scope in that as well, I think. But the idea of cultural content being created on the moon and then bringing that back is a really interesting and new perspective, I suppose, because we're always looking at, as you say, from earthbound kind of perspectives at the moon, thinking about that kind of as an import from the moon bounce. Yeah, fascinating. I wonder if any other kind of ideas from across the panel of things that are going to be brought back from this probably once in a lifetime opportunity to spend time up on the moon.
I just recalled a conversation I had a few months ago with an artist who was experimenting with Morse code. Joseph, you just reminded me of this artist who actually was considering sending signals, I don't know to what planet, probably moon, but he was considering sending something that has never been done before, sending porno to outer space. And he was very interested in how such a complex form and format and genre of porno could be condensed into just Morse code. And he all of a sudden became very interested in how the specific type of communication and format affects the expression of this form of art, if we can call them forms of art. So I would imagine that the unique kind of technologies that would restrain or constrain ourselves, communication, life supports, everything would affect the way we think, the way we look at ourselves, but also the way we express ourselves. So I would imagine we would bring new forms of art, even though it might be something like porno, like extraterrestrial porno. So yeah, I would go this kind of path.
And that's not to mention the hangovers from all that astro vodka as well.
Definitely. But also, I think it's worth mentioning that there are already a few narratives circling around in this kind of topic of conversion narratives. One of the most known is overview effect. It's an effect that felt by pilots and astronauts who have spent substantial amount of time in high altitudes, whether it's an airplane or is it the moon or whatever. But the thing is that this narrative has been popularized and romanticized by certain policymakers and sometimes by certain politicians and so on, which has little to do with the reality of this conversion of these people, which actually is much more complex and complicated. And it just quite recently, even space psychologists and also a few space artists started to look into what happens to those people who have spent substantial amount of time above. So all of a sudden we've got new kinds of conversion narratives. One of them is break-off effect, that people actually feel very isolated, nervous, alone, sometimes with mental breakdowns. And this is something that is not popularized because it has, it's not pitching space flight in the way that policymakers would want. But anyway, so I think this kind of conversation like this one might expand the vocabulary that would explain what happens to those beings when we come back. Yeah.
Charmian?
like to carry on from that, yeah, because of the project I just mentioned earlier, where we all grew the plants remotely together. And I think there's been a lot of kind of writing about how seeing something grow during the pandemic was like a good way of protecting yourself from that feeling of isolation, and also that kind of monotony of lockdown, you know, like every day was the same, and then you could see something going from seed to plant that gave you a sense of time. So yeah, I think if we were coming back to the moon as a group and we were all going back to Lithuania or Basel or wherever we were going back to, I'd like some way of staying in touch. And that doesn't have to say that we need like a WhatsApp group or anything, but maybe something that connects us all together, which could be one of Yu's plants, the vodka plants that he's specially modified to grow on the moon. And maybe if we can help them to survive on Earth as well, like that would help us to kind of feel connected to each other once we were apart.
I want to pick up on something that Juliana said about the overview effect, because I think it points to the larger context of this question, and it reminds me of something that Joseph said in his introduction. So the overview effect is more or less instantiated when the person who sees the planet returns to the planet. But if we consider something like a one-way trip, I wonder, you know, what becomes of the overview effect if it can't be, you know, sort of like grounded back to the thing that was viewed. And so for this question, you know, what do you bring back? I think it's really wonderful. The psychological perspective as a souvenir is a kind of very interesting artifact of one's experience that, you know, I was thinking of physical objects and maybe that was short-sighted, but the fact that something like an overview effect demands a return. So we, the lunar denizens who are returning to Earth, we're lucky, we get to experience that. But maybe the ones who are like moon bound, you know, inexorably, I don't know if they'll experience that, I'm not sure. So that's one thing. And then I guess this might be kibosh, this might be boring and obvious, but I think it would be really important for all of the denizens to journal their experiences. I find that when we revisit strange, you know, austere places like the Himalayas or McMurdo in Antarctica, you know, we have Shackleton's journals. And I think that those sort of inform a personal emotional experience with something as scary as like a lunar step. And even though it's not our experience and we can't, you know, sympathize or empathize directly, we can't help but draw some connections. And I think that it'd be curious to see how our journals from our trip to Italy differ from our journal from our trip to the moon.
I think the fabrication and building of the mythology of the place as well through this kind of recounting of it could be a really interesting part here. Sorry, Joseph, I cut you off.
No problem. I think Juliana maybe wants to say something too. Should I just? Okay.
You
okay.
went fast.
Yeah, really interesting idea so far. I was also just thinking along the psychological, the impact of seeing the Earth from above, from afar. There's also a case, I guess, of turning that perspective around. If you're a lunar denizen born on the moon, for example, or there for a long time, perhaps your view of the Earth rise, or seeing the Earth in the sky, would be as normal to them as it would be for us seeing the moon in the sky. I mean, we're going. I'll cycle home tonight and I'll probably look and see the moon. I won't fall off my bike because of it, or I won't, stop what I'm doing. So there's a certain, whenever someone talks about the overview effect, I mean, Jeff Bezos just recently, he kind of used it as a kind of preface to his $2 billion environmental fund that he's pledging, because of course he has his own rocket, so he can do these things. He can go to space and experience it. And so, there's this sense that it's something incredibly profound, perspective changing. And nevertheless, you also have the sense that we've had in history the whole Earth movement inspired by these first images of seeing the Earth whole. We know what the Earthrise image is, so they're already kind of very much part of our mainstream culture. So I also wonder what happens to those images, those experiences as they become normalized, especially when you see, maybe it's more interesting for the denizens to see the moon as a whole and get a new perspective on their experience being there too, because their experience will be likely a lot more defined by containment, confinement, constraint, which I think is another underlying theme to a lot of maybe what we'll talk about. But so maybe there's also an inversion going on, which might also lead to new ideas.
Julijonas?
Yeah, just want a little bit to expand on what Caitlin said about those unique kind of experiences or effects that would be encountered or even would establish themselves being in there. I think if just finding proper language or just labeling them is really, really interesting, because it is only when you find a label you name it, it is when you realize that you're experiencing something unique. It's kind of linguistic determinism, but it has lots of to do with all kind of also different languages. For example, in Japanese, there are so many specific words that define such emotions and experiences that have nothing, that would sound nonsense in other languages. For example, this Japanese term that defines this unique kind of experience, getting out of a cold water, out of little lake under specific moonlight, and so on and so on. Lots of parameters in this kind of experience, and there is one word defining that. For us, it sounds too complicated and doesn't make any sense. But for the Japanese, it defines this unique kind of experience that happens in Japanese landscape. Yeah, so it also has something to do with, is it Sapir-Whorf, the hypothesis? Forgot, probably sounds like that. If you've seen the movie Arrival, there is this kind of hypothesis is shown really nicely, but to such an extreme extent that if you delve yourself into unique kind of language, in that case extraterrestrial language, you become perceiving things radical different. In that case, the linguist, the extraterrestrial linguist, starts to travel in time. So I think it would be really beautiful to think of a unique kind of vocabulary that would be coined there.
I think that's a really interesting point, the language of it, and it kind of reminds me of the Portuguese term saudade, which is the kind of, again, not really possible to translate, this idea of a kind of nostalgia or a sense of longing for something, which maybe can kind of bring us neatly into the kind of next part of what we wanted to discuss with everyone, which was this kind of idea of a sense of belonging, an idea of permanence. What kind of the moon dwelling as an opportunity to flee the Earth's kind of atmosphere, but maybe this leading to certain physiological or cultural adaptations, and how we adapt to these in our moon-based environment, or when we return back to Earth in this kind of environment. So how we, I suppose, relate to the nostalgic idea of Earth from the moon, but then when we're coming back again, which things from the moon do we miss almost?
I have a weird entry into this. And this kind of, I have an idea about this, and this sort of ties to something that Charmian had mentioned yesterday when we all kind of like plotted our direction through things, in terms of like physiological effects that might be these strange artifacts upon our bodies returning from the moon. You were talking about the physics garden, and that you send new seeds out according to the lunar cycle. I wonder what the women in this environment on the moon, how they're physiologically impacted by living on the moon, which has, you know, a different kind of circadian rhythm. It's 2 weeks dark, 2 weeks light, and we see only half the Earth at any given time. I wonder if there's some sort of like I guess we're built robust because we've evolved built on the environment of the Earth, but when we go to the moon, it might be that the difference in the environment optimizes certain functionality in a way that would be like sad to lose when we come back to Earth. And so I just wonder, you know, how are women physically impacted on a monthly basis once they've occupied the moon as opposed to witnessing it from Earth? It's just a question.
I don't know, guys, if you know anything about what kind of effects of weightlessness to people who spend substantial amount of time in zero gravity, but there are really beautiful effects. For example, all of a sudden you've got here in such places that you would never have on Earth because of a unified and kind of changed circulation of blood and also other fluids. You've got areas in your body that have never had certain minerals or whatever. But also there are interesting things with nails change their shape. I'll also get longer at certain parts. So there are tiny moments that could be seen only in diaries of astronauts or of cosmonauts. And I would imagine those tiny details would also would happen in reduced gravity, which is not weightlessness. It just almost half of earthly gravity.
Charmian?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm really interested in what Caitlin just said about this idea that the artifacts that we bring back might actually just be part of our bodies and they might never change again. Obviously, I don't know if everyone in the audience knows, but you guys all know that I'm 9 months pregnant now. So like I've seen my body completely change. First time pregnant, so I've seen my body completely change, and I know some of those things aren't going to change back, or they're new. Like Juliana, you just mentioned the shape of the nails. Like my nails grow. I have to cut them every day. Like they grow so quickly, just from this strange thing that's happening to my body, which isn't that strange because it happens to lots and lots of people on Earth. But if we go to the moon, there might be something much more subtle that only we would understand. And I love the idea that that's the souvenir that we would bring home, be it good or bad. It would at least be a memory.
You suspect that something like child rearing is made easier in lower gravity? I wonder if pregnancy in 1/6 gravity would be like somewhat nicer than pregnancy on Earth.
They actually, a couple of years ago, I think like an Amsterdam-based sort of technology startup was going to like speculated that they'd like to be the first to send a woman into space to give birth. And like they kind of proposed that as like a speculative event. And I mean, obviously people brought up all sorts of different things, like what nation would the baby belong to? Like, how would you get it its passport? How would the woman feel without access to the same medical care that she might have Earthside? Or but yeah, that was a super interesting kind of experiment, and maybe things like gravity would make a big difference to that early stage when you're just so heavy, and then you've got this child. Like maybe being helped by less gravity being around you would be quite positive.
You would need a centrifuge to help give a birth.
Yes, Juliana, I was about to say the birth part would be the bit which I'd be most apprehensive about in terms of lacking a certain amount of gravity.
There's always a certain amount of gravity in these situations. Oof,
Nice.
Sorry. Too easy. Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating kind of aspect of it, and thinking about the kind of life cycle up in space, and also the idea that these physiological kind of traces or remnants start to be there that kind of tie us, and almost that creates a way of building our kind of network through this shared kind of physical trait or physiological trait that we're bringing back to us. One of the things we were also thinking about is the kind of beyond the physiological, I suppose, the psychological attraction of going home almost, and maybe I don't know if we think that's something that you kind of would be a strong draw or an attractor back to coming back to Earth, or something that people are actually more reluctant to do or reticent about.
Caitlin?
I was going to continue the birth-death conversation, but I'm not sure if that's...
I'll go for it as well.
Yeah, okay.
Totally.
I don't want to like take this pregnancy and like, tease it out, but when we're talking about this comparative life thing between Earth humans and lunar humans, we don't know, we've debated about the duration of the term on Mare Nectaris, but let's say it's a year, 150 people alone in a base, like sex is inevitable, pregnancy is inevitable, and then therefore birth would be inevitable, difficult as it may be in 1/6 gravity. And, I think that has a huge impact on one's decision to stay or go. Do you take something so young and fragile on a spaceship back to Earth? Are you, as a parent, compelled to stay on the moon almost, indefinitely and have like the first lunar child? So I wanted to think about that, because I think in terms of this artifacts question, the first question before we shift to Andrew's, something that humans are really good at is like kind of instantiating these important monumental moments in celebration, something like birth, and then eventually something like death. And so I'd be curious to talk a little bit about like how the lunar denizens would celebrate something like a birth on the moon, or more curiously, what do funereal rites look like when someone inevitably dies at the base? Can we bury someone? What are the things that we, shroud their bodies in? I wanted to think about like the lunar life cycle and how it's celebrated, but we can pin that and move to the psychological thing and come back if it's too wiggly.
No, I'm well happy to go wingly. But no, this is something actually that was quite interesting in the first conversation back in June, that I think DeWitt started talking about new kind of mortuary sciences and eventually new rituals around the prepping of dead bodies, and was potentially talking about mummifying, or the fact that we could actually just expose and leave the bodies out on the surface of the moon, since they would not necessarily decay, because there's no kind of like decaying processes or organic processes that lead to the decay of these bodies, and eventually turn those into almost like not necessarily
kind of mausoleum almost, isn't it?
Mausoleum, like it's a mix between mausoleum and monument, I guess. But it's interesting because suddenly it kind of asks you to shift your perspective on that, what Caitlin, what you just said about this kind of life-death cycle. So you see it under another perspective, another point that actually Tamara made in that particular conversation was also that perhaps it's a new kind of level of rituals where we totally accept the fact that our bodies can be recycled into something else, and you get recycled into, I don't know, like the cliche thing, get recycled into I don't know, fertilizers or whatever, or fuel, or go full on Soylent Green maybe. But the thing that is interesting is like suddenly your Lunar Denizens' relation to that life cycle of birth and death could be completely different, and not necessarily a replica or a simulation of what happens on Earth.
You can also think of getting back to stardust. You just freeze to absolute zero, the body to absolute zero, and what you need to do is just to crush a little bit, and all of a sudden you would have the body sprinkle around
like some sort of like weird morbid fireworks.
I wouldn't say that very term morbid would be different. You have to redefine what is considered morbid. That's why making a monument out of human bodies, turning into an asteroid, would be, I think, not that morbid as it sounds now.
Charmian?
No, I had nothing serious to say. I was just going to say it's like when Buffy the Vampire Slayer stakes one of her vampires, they turn into dust. It would be kind of cool. I'll go back to my
all good cultural references, really strong, which is absolutely perfect.
Also, the way you say crush Julijonas is just perfect. I don't know if I'm going to complicate this unnecessarily, but I feel as though the activity, or what it means to be on the base itself, must have implications in terms of how you would deal with births and life and death, for example. If it's something where, we discussed this yesterday a bit in the premise of the scenario in 2133. There's this base that is set up on Mare Nectaris as a response to an energy crisis on Earth, and so you're there with a very specific strategic Earth-centric purpose, which doesn't necessarily sound so desirable. Nevertheless, we could turn it another way and say there's, maybe it's the other question is, what draws people to the Mare Nectaris in the first place, because that will also impact on their desire to maybe have a family there, to also come back again. But like I said, maybe this is also going too wide at this point.
No, I really like that. I think what Caitlin brought up, this idea that there's 150 people there and inevitably they're going to have sex with each other at some point. I think that happens a lot with the groups. I've got a friend who does the tours of the Arctic. They take like quite often younger people, like 20 to 21, and they go and live in the Arctic for like 3 or 4 months over winter. And I think essentially her job a lot of the time was to stop them all from sleeping with each other. Even though they've got other things to do. They're there for like scientific purposes. They're there for research. They're having this incredible opportunity to be in the Arctic. There's so much more going on, but you also have to think about those base instincts that young people will necessarily, not all young people, but everybody wouldn't have. And like maybe create some sort of rituals, or might be some regiments around it that are completely different from what we experience on Earth. I just don't know what they would be. Caitlin, did you have an idea of what they might kind of develop into?
No, I expect, as Joseph set it up, it's like Mare Nectaris is kind of a functional space, and those who volunteer to go, are doing so to like serve their planet, or, help, I can't say country anymore if we're talking about the moon, but like to serve their planet and to do sort of a lot of necessary labor for the sake of future human civilization. But as you say, like, we are humans, we have these instincts, and they're not base. I wouldn't even call them base. I think that something like the physical expression of love is one of the most awesome things that humans are capable of doing. I'd be curious to know what that's like in 1/6 gravity. I don't know, but so I don't know what those sort of like limitations or rituals would be. I just expect that because we are the same biological entity as we were on the moon, that activity would culminate in the same sort of thing, which is a new life. And so I'm just curious about that. And then just to draw it back to death, but I'm not trying to like steer us towards birth or death in either way. I think that we've all taken this up as the assumption is that if someone dies on the moon, that the funereal rite would be something like a lunar thing. Maybe we make a monument out of these bodies, or we let it freeze into something and kind of crack it up and reorient those particles to use or something, which seems really utilitarian to me. I think one thing that humans are naturally is sentimental and nostalgic, and that's why this is down to earth. And so to answer Andrew's question, like what compels us to go back? I think if I had a loved one who passed away on the moon, I might be compelled to return to Earth to bury them there. I don't know. I wonder, yeah. The human sentimental experience of life and death is a very different thing. And it seems to me so far, the only entities on this lunar base are human. And I like exploring those psychological limitations, but also like expressions.
I worked on this project a few years ago with the artist Taryn Simon, who brought together professional mourners from lots of different cultures around the world. It was a project called An Occupation of Loss, and it took place in the Armory in New York, and we Art Angel presented it in London as well. And she essentially found people who are paid to be at funerals and to perform, or to perform a form of grieving. So it can be musical, but it can also be crying, like get paid to cry at a funeral, from lots of different countries. So Azerbaijan, Greece, China, India, like all around the world. And what was really striking about them when they all performed together in the space, for a start, it was, heartbreaking. Like you felt something through each performance. You realized that even though that they were performing and they were doing their job, they were being paid to do, they weren't actually sad. You still felt touched, even if it wasn't your culture. But how different all of those acts are, like just within Earth cultures, there's already like a million different ways that we mourn. So I think, yeah, the idea that we might kind of settle on one way of memorializing the dead on the moon is a fallacy, really.
That's a really great example. Oh, sorry.
Oh, Joseph, you were first.
By a second. No, I think these are all really fascinating examples. And I think it just goes to show in a way how powerful and how, maybe demanding is the wrong word, but how much is given for, these kind of rituals of mourning, humans' emotional needs being as powerful and as important as the more biological ones, let's say. And the lengths we go to fulfill them. I think I just saw briefly in the chat, Nick mentioned the kind of ritual of bringing the fallen home, which is of course in a very literal sense, it's kerosene, it's a plane, it's distance, it has a global footprint for the sake of mourning. And so if you take that to the moon, then the lengths that we might be prepared to go to satisfy those human emotional needs, what costs are we willing to pay in terms of creating you can think of cemeteries on Earth, this idea of burying people underground. Cemeteries take up space. There then become different creative ways of dealing with that. In Japan, for example, they have my wife's Japanese. I don't know that word that Juliana mentioned earlier, unfortunately, but they have very creative ways of dealing with, incredibly dense metropolis of Tokyo, respecting the dead. Things are condensed and technologized, and they have to be inventive because of the limitations of the space. And if you are a relatively small base on the moon, 200 people maximum, with a very limited range of movement, do you have to settle on something, one particular ritual? What is that governed by, those decisions? Is it a kind of universalizing of who gets to go, who's there, their nationalities, their backgrounds, their cultures, or is it in response to the very harsh environment that you all found yourself in?
Juliana's.
Oh, I just wanted to complicate the whole thing. What, for example, instead of thinking of a unique kind of environment in which humans would live, it would be different kind of humans already. coming to the moon. For example, I think I would refer to the term cyborg, because originally the very idea of cyborg was referring to human beings, naked human beings, who would survive in hostile environment of outer space. That was the original idea of the term cyborg. And imagine now having those individuals without those terrestrial or anthropocentric needs, food, shelter, shitting, hygiene, whatever. Putting all of this aside, having those individuals in close proximity to each other for a substantial amount of time, what they would do, how they would live, it would be total different kind of thing. Would it be culture there or not? It's very, very difficult to imagine something that is without those, human desires and needs. And that might happen, I think, because we're talking about quite far future. So that might be something radically different.
I mean, even one step prior, I feel like to call for individuals to go to lunar bases, it's almost like this big, great filter of like psychological capacity and like a willingness to be without these sort of creature comforts to a certain degree. So, I mean, we're kind of half cyborgs at this point in the more conventional sense, not the traditional sense that you just described, but like here we are zooming across our computers and reliant on technology in an inseparable way. But so there's the grand filter of the human example. And then once things kind of necessarily evolve into this sort of cyborg example, I do think that an emergent culture is inevitable, but it would be curious to see how Earthlings versus first generation, austere Earthlings versus the cyborg lunar development, how those compare across time.
Yeah, I think this is very convenient, because I think this is another part that I wanted to explore as well, just like what is, from an Earther's perspective, what is the perspective on the Lunar Denizens and the settlement in general? Like, because obviously you may at the start believe or look at it as a kind of, I don't know, pioneers going there and making some sort of like sacrifice maybe, but over a certain period of time you might develop different, I don't know, sensibility towards the Lunar Denizens in general. So what are the Earth's perspective on this? And eventually after that we'll go back to the Lunar Denizens perspective on the other way around in terms of communication.
I'm just I know that I'm talking a lot, but I just this is a perfect, I happen to right now be reading, and it's not a fiction, but it's like a sort of novelized history of the Donner Party, which is what happened when American frontiers individuals from Chicago essentially did the Manifest Destiny thing and moved westward in a wagon train. And things went poorly and food became scarce, and eventually, spoiler, people started eating each other. But I'm at the beginning, no one's eaten yet. And something that's interesting is that all of the individuals who went westward and sacrificed the comforts of their old home to build what they thought would be like a prosperous homestead in the future, were doing so selfishly. It was just for their own particular gain. And so now, of course, the rest of the kind of settled America gained something themselves, because these people like forged the pathway, and then it made it easier for other individuals to kind of move westward. And colonial as it is, but of course we're talking about space settlements, it does forge the path for future prosperity for others, but the initial cause for this move was extremely personal and selfish. And it makes me wonder if those who are going to the lunar base first are almost trying to like stake their land in the beginning of a new future. That of course does benefit others, but it's just in terms of the origin point, why go in the first place from an Earth perspective, there's precedent for selfishness and survival.
I was just reading nothing related, but nothing related. And I'm just reading comments from Sands and obviously in the chat, talking about the mementos and souvenirs, and asking if you would go through the gift shop on your way out of the settlement. That is if the settlement looks like an airport.
I also appreciate Glenn's enthusiasm in the chat for Caitlin's point, because I think it's very, very important, because I think that narrative of going on in a selfish, or a group of maybe of individuals acting for themselves but for the greater good as well, is something which is bound up in colonialism, but also in space narratives. I was just reading about Robert Heinlein's book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, a science fiction novel, which introduces this term, the rational anarchist, which is this idea that, you know, this lunar penal colony is, it leads a revolution against Earth on the premise that, you know, certain hardy individuals out in the western, no, what's the word? The wild lunar landscape as a kind of extraterrestrial frontier can act away from government agency, away from other kind of social constraints in their eyes. So just to add that, you know, there's this continuum which is carrying on into, and also Heinlein and other science fiction writers are very inspirational for the current new space advocates such as Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. And so there is this continuity there. So going back to the denizens, then yeah, maybe there's an element of why come back, or if you're coming back, you know, what did you not gain, or what did you gain? So maybe there's some animosity there.
It's another part that we were discussing as well, but like I think it's totally, I mean, it fits with what we're discussing now, this idea that we mentioned in the previous conversation that yes, does the I mean, and I also mentioned that in that sort of like short recap, so does these lunar settlement becomes like a gateway to a new frontier in that respect, and also a gateway to a promising future. So it's more about like building those narratives around, and eventually one of the things that we were wondering is like, would this end up by having the lunar settlement itself having its own political entity, in the sense that could Mare Nectaris be actually end up being its own micronation to a certain extent? I don't know if anyone's got a particular, or does it belong to the global union like within the fiction, or?
I mean, some of these things tie in quite neatly with some of the things that Caitlin, you were talking about, this kind of frontier mentality and the wagon train, this idea of extending and kind of going into new territories. Perhaps this area to kind of link these a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it's like crossing the Mississippi River was like the lunar settlement on the way to California, which is like the Mars. So it's like with each step, something new kind of splinters open. And so, you know, I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly the trajectory that we are contemporarily building. Of course, our lunar settlement is fictional and it takes place in the future. But when we talk about things that are being built on the moon now, it's mostly for capital industry, and it's mostly as a throughway to further exploration or possible settlement of Mars. And so it's almost like each step across the river, there are two stones that you can go in either direction, but there's always more space to kind of conquer and explore. So
I think there's also, it points to a sense of, I guess, proximity of the moon to Earth. Tamara Alvarez was on the first panel of this series, and she, for her PhD research, she's an anthropologist, and she writes about the moon as the 8th continent. So very much pairing the moon to the Earth in close proximity. And so, which is also interesting if you think about, you know, the term outer space itself, and this idea of, you know, we in the kind of collective sense have marked the 100-kilometer line above the Earth's atmosphere, or above the ground rather, as the Kármán line, which is supposed to distinguish those who have left planet Earth or not. And so for the denizens, you know, are you humans? Are you Earthlings? Are you outsiders? And I think returning, are you in some sense even just arriving? But so, sorry to kind of complicate things again, but I think just this sense of relationality, there's a diversity in that, just in terms of how we view the moon in relation to Earth.
But wouldn't be that it would be no big effect? Just, you know, 200 people would come back. It's just, you know, it's just like having a little bit more astronauts coming back to Earth. So that would be not that radical as that might sound. I would rather imagine this more like source for research and further investigation of what just happened, what could be done, or what kind of Zug effect happened. I don't know if you know, there is in science fiction a known kind of literal device that is used to alienate characters to themselves. So when you, I would imagine when you go to the moon for a substantial amount of time, first of all, what you do is just you are going to alienate yourself, and what would happen when you come back? You re-alienate yourself again. So that would be kind of double Zug effect. And that really complicates itself, because the true Zug effect is actually not finding alien in somebody else. That's how the narrative works with Zug effect. It is at the end of the narrative, you find yourself an alien, the alien that you were looking for, or even you were trying to kill that alien. And it is that moment when you realize that you are an alien that you were looking for, is this unique kind of hard to explain moment that is open for all kind of interpretations, that has no single way of explaining. And that's why it's quite popular thought experiment in speculative philosophy and speculative realism as well, and also contemporary science fiction, which I think the ultimate complication of, I just wanted to continue Joseph argument of complicating things.
Oh, we've still got 45 minutes. We can do it.
I mean, I'm just reading from the comment section. I mean, the chat actually. Nick points. Wait, Joseph. Sorry.
Please go with Nick. Go with Nick.
No, I was just about saying, like, he's proposing to return. Like, his question is more about, like, what is the legal status of people returning if they were born on Mare Nectaris? If, like, also the legal, I guess, status of this kind of like relationship that you have from the Lunar Denizens on Mare Nectaris and maybe the global union.
I wonder where they would go. I mean, just simple things like, where would they land back on Earth? And then if they were born there, or, you know, where would they be, where would they take up residence? And how would that decision be made? Many questions. All these conversation points just lead to more and more questions.
But you have to know that all of them would be wheelchaired. All of them. All of them will be disabled. A new kind of lunar disability. Because...
No, please, go.
No, it's just what happens to those people who spend substantial amount of time in weightlessness.
Yeah, actually, Juliana, I wanted to set you up based on our conversation yesterday, because I was thinking about how would you spot a lunar denizen on Earth? And, you know, we were talking yesterday about haircuts. I don't know if you want to take up from there, but maybe there are some other distinctive characteristics that lunar denizens or ex-denizens would either be forced to live with, for lack of a better word, or maybe the others that they would maybe wear or display as a kind of badge of honor that, yes, I was on the moon.
That would take 3 or 4 hours to expand on this topic. When you think of any kind of settlement that is in the opposite of Earth, in a hostile environment, you are talking about artificial ecosystem, and any artificial ecosystem is based on some kind of ventilation systems that, you know, probably it's one of the very first thing that you need to do is to supply oxygen to the habitants. So all the ventilation systems have little problem is that they have filters, and filters do not like our hair. And so even if you cut, okay, you can think of a unique kind of that would be probably quite similar to the way poo is transformed in weightless settlements in International Space Station, for example. That would be quite similar to haircut. You would need to have complicated technology that would what's the English word? The synonym for throwing away,
Dispose.
Well, you need to deal with the leftovers of air. But if for example, if you do not cut your hair, you would have lots of hair that would just, it's not stuck to yourself. You would leave lots of hair around you. And especially in the lunar environment where you would be with a little bit weaker health. So you leave lots of hair in the system. So that might be also a complication. So yeah, and in one way or another, that would affect the way you look and the way the genre of this unique kind of art form, haircut, would be affected. So I would imagine that would be new types of haircut and also technologies.
I don't know if you, perhaps from some of your research, and you were saying earlier about the fingernails growing a lot more in outer space. Is it the same with hair when you're in a lower gravity environment? Are you going to have a large growth, particularly over the top kind of condition here, if you like, compared to being on Earth?
You would have hair all over the body. You would have everywhere.
Okay, so actually you're going to have these kind of hairy people coming back to Earth. So actually these lunar denizens, when they come back, will have to kind of conform to, well, maybe there are new kind of standards of earthly kind of aesthetics that these people need to conform to, or it becomes like Joseph, you were saying, a kind of signature that you've been up in this space, you've been in this place, this environment, and you're proud to show it, perhaps.
I just have a quick comment about the disposal of, these bodily things that are necessary in a closed environment like the lunar base. There's actually a precedent for this. So there have been several crewed missions to the moon already. I think the reason that we think about the moon so often is because there's precedent and it's similar and we've been there, so it seems like easier and familiar. But they needed to figure out what to do with their fecal matter. And instead of devising systems to effectively dispose of that on board, they literally just bag it in plastic and leave it on the moon. And so there is literally a topographical map of the lunar surface where every single man has ever been, because there's a bag of poop with their genetic sample right there on the moon. So I think that's just one kind of weird precedent that's already been there. But I just want to address this sort of physical change that happens that could make it easy for Earthlings to distinguish between those who have been to the moon and those who haven't. Because there's this interesting conversation going on in the chat about re-abled or differently abled individuals who are coming from the moon, who are physiologically changed. Perhaps their bone density is decreased, but their circulation is optimized, whatever happens to the body when you're in the moon. And I think it would be curious to see, as more people go to the moon base and come back and this cycle happens, so that it's not just the first 200 people, but eventually it becomes a little more ubiquitous, this lunar experience, how Earth engineering will be changed to accommodate those individuals. How does architecture take its impact from having to now reintroduce lunar citizens if they're, part of this global 8th continent thing? Because it seems that eventually the way that the Earth looks is going to be inspired by or a consequence of whatever has happened on the moon. And I think that's really interesting, it goes both ways, how Earth impacts whatever structures we build on the moon for humans going there, but then how Earthlings restructure the Earth to accommodate those lunar Earthlings. It's an interesting question.
You would need lunar simulators. You can look up into all kinds of devices that NASA and other agencies came up with to simulate lunar gravity and other circumstances. So yeah, it's already there. You just need to scale up and turn into new habitats on Earth. Lunar analogs, yeah.
But if those simulations become more ubiquitous, do you think less people would go to the moon?
I don't know. I think, to be honest, it's not that nice in there. It's actually to be quite boring. You, you need to put yourself in such a situation to imagine how does it to empathize to lunar habitat in such a way that it would have physical effect on you. That's only the way you can see whether you want to go there or not. So probably the closest one is to live in those research facilities in Antarctica and elsewhere, or even those lunar analogs that certain agencies curate and conduct. And I don't know if you've heard any diaries from those people who spend some time in there. It's really boring in there. They talk like months and months chatting about fart, how they are farting. That's what they do there. Take a look at those diaries. It's so boring.
Joseph, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think the two things I wanted to add to Julianas's points. One, I also agree that I think it's not the most desirable place to go in the world, in the universe. Sorry. And the second thing is just this notion of the theme park as a way of going back to Caitlin's interest in communicating the experience. I mean, of course, there's a plethora of simulators that you could combine together. I mean, here you go, you could make a new theme park dedicated to that. But I think also going back to what we were talking about earlier, some of those psychological particularities and even the vocabulary, the mindset, how could you communicate that? And I think also the denizens coming back to Earth. One thing I was thinking about was, what would it feel like to spend so much time, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years in such a both isolated and constrained environment, and then come back to Earth where you can step outside your front door and go for a walk and do all these things which we take for granted, but might be quite a shock. And so how could you communicate that actually, I was thinking about there's certain phobias. I think it's agoraphobia, or part of agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces or lack of control, or an inability to escape or to close the airlock in this case, maybe. So maybe, and also that actually ties into what Julianis was talking about, this idea of estrangement, destabilizing your perceptions of the everyday, finding yourself as the alien. So maybe there's an estrangement theme park to go alongside the lunar experience. And so you can get both sides of the deal, the experience of what it is like to walk in different gravity, but also the experience of what it means to come back to your own planet, because I think that's also a key experience. And that also goes back to the overview effect, because that experience of returning to your planet, having seen it from afar, what difference does it make if more and more people have that experience?
Charmian?
I was just going to say that happened a lot in the early days of VR and AR, like a lot of the experiences weren't necessarily nice ones. Like people were kind of making projects to help experience things that aren't great. So I think, Joseph, that's really likely that actually there would be this what Caitlin calls a demusement park, like something to enable people to experience being on the moon, or like what it's like to be on the moon that isn't positive and fun. And it's but actually I think it starts before anyone goes as well. Like Caitlin earlier was mentioning this problem of the frontier mentality with the recruitment bias, like when they say who wants to go to the moon, who ends up going. Actually, all of this work on communication and how you talk about the moon, or how you kind of talk about what life will be like on it, that has to be worked on really hard prior to the people being recruited, because that will make a difference to who goes there and who comes back. So it's not just about what we say when we get back, it's more like, what do we say about what it will be like before we even go? Otherwise we're going to end up with a specific subset of very space interested types of people, and maybe miss out on some like more complex relationships and different kind of perspectives if we don't work hard from the beginning to communicate this in an open way.
And I think you don't need any complicated technologies or large-scale amusement parks. We already have all kinds of forms of art. For example, science fiction, whether cinema or literature, already might work as kind of simulators for those experiences that you might have in outer space. Yeah.
They're often not necessarily showing how dull it might be, though. maybe this is an area that is there's some scope for some more development. I know it's something we mentioned as well in preparation a bit, the kind of importance or the potential value of cultural aspects of life on Earth being kind of transplanted to these kind of bodies and other places, basically. So how we can actually make it more interesting, maybe not just with Astro Vodka, but other means as well. We spoke at the very beginning of the session about the idea of music and culture as a creation and things that are created in these spaces. Perhaps we need to think about maybe with this kind of bigger kind of pool of people up there, how we can make the most of that and create opportunities for making new things to enliven and enrich this experience, perhaps.
Well, I would imagine a lunar base for art residency, but I would imagine artists would fool around so much so that it would be a total disaster.
Be very dangerous.
Very dangerous. So they would need to come up with new kind of art that would deal with these unique kind of circumstances that require super sensitivity, super responsibility, super cooperation. Yeah, maybe that would require a total different kind of art form that we can't even imagine now.
Joseph.
Yes, there's a few things. I think just on Juliana's last point, I think that I guess that kind of conflict between the artistic poetic license to interpret as, you know, outer space however you want, but then actually dealing with the constraints of just going to space itself. And we talked a bit about yesterday how constraints are also an opportunity for expression. And so that's something where maybe, yeah, we do need a lunar residency, or there is even currently a Japanese billionaire cooperating with Elon Musk, offering to send 8 musicians around the moon, or artist musicians. So I think, you know, more opportunities for artists and designers and others to, I think, engage with the realities of outer space, but also from an artistic perspective is really needed, because going back to Andrew's point earlier, and also what Juliana was saying, the stories from Apollo, for example, I mean, their mission was very unpoetic in a way. I mean, the imagery is spectacular, but the reality of what they had to do there, I was just reading this great book called Moondust, which is interviews of, I think at the time, the 9 last denizens of the moon, or the last Apollo astronauts. And there was one story by Alan Bean, who has now become an artist, and he spends this entire time painting images of Apollo or of the moon missions, because when he was there, I feel like he said it himself, the first thing he thought of when he came off the moon, off the lander, was we're 20 minutes late. You know, he hadn't even had time to take in the surroundings. So we're lacking that opportunity for people to break away from this very regimented mission type scenario. Or maybe there's a balance to be struck, because as Juliana was saying, it's a hostile environment, it's extreme, it depends on a certain level of responsibility, cooperation, understanding of what has to happen to exist in space. Nevertheless, we also need that room for art, for culture. How can we make that balance?
So there's this came up in the Moonlight a little bit. Nicholas Demancho was talking about the primary complaint of people on space missions, specifically the Apollo missions. And it's that these were essentially like engineering missions for scientific tasks, and they were so overscheduled that they just begged for a single minute to look out the window at the Earth, right? They were so incapable of reflecting upon this tremendous experience. And so that seems sort of right in line with what Joseph was talking about. And then I also just want to say, in terms of developing new art forms on the moon, you know, by virtue of the fact that we do need very sophisticated engineering to get to the moon, quite often it seems in the consciousness of the human mind that it should be scientists and engineers that are going. But now we're talking about being more kind of cognitively diverse about like what certain talents can be explored. And there's a way that art contributes to science in that direction too. And I wonder, like, in a setting as different from Earth as the moon, if we could make it safe, if maybe the first inhabitants of a lunar habitat should be artists because of all of the weird material manipulation that they'd be able to do with oil paints or clay or various, you know, sculptural material pieces. Because I imagine that this is essentially a material science experiment. And if a sculptor goes out there safely in a suit in 1/6 gravity, or, bombarded by radiation, what have you. I'd be curious to see what innovation materially emerges from kind of an unbridled artistic expression, as opposed to, what happens in an environment which is essentially just a simulated Earth environment where you can walk around and you can use your hands in the same way. It almost seems like future engineering feats might evolve from the artistic innovations that individuals on the lunar habitat would build out of their artistic experimentation.
I think art, well, maybe certain forms of art, are very efficient, economical ways of going to whatever point in universe you want, without making any rocket. You can go to whatever you want without going. What I mean by that is that lots of artistic narratives are about kind of creating unique kind of quasi-real experience of traveling somewhere, experiencing something. Why I'm saying quasi-real? Because it is art that allows you to suspend this belief. You know that it's fiction, but you put yourself so much, you almost are there. It is a simulation at its finest. And that's why I would imagine artistic space program would be not based on having a launch pad or rocket, but something that would happen here on Earth. You would not need to physically be transposed or physically be transported somewhere. It's a little bit like what some Aboriginals are saying about the Western space programs. They're saying that they've been traveling to outer space for ages, and none of them have any rockets.
But Julianas, you in this fictional experiment are an artist on a lunar base. So what are you doing with your time? You did go. What are you doing?
If I
He's
find
traveling
myself
home.
No, first of all, what I would do, I would freeze myself and would crash and come back to the origins of myself, to Stardust.
You would bombard the planet with your reconstituted elements.
For
yeah.
eternity. Yeah, lunar suicide, it would be really interesting to do.
Maybe there's, I guess, well, of course there's a layers to this idea of, bringing an artist to space. And I sort of described this earlier, kind of carving out room for more poetic or artistic perspectives amongst the protocols and the rigmarole of actually living in an artificial environment. But I think there's maybe a point to kind of bridge the two. I think this is also what Julianas was getting at. Also, conveniently, Sans Fish in the chat, he is a designer, and he produced a fantastic project called the Telematron, which is a musical instrument which performs specifically in microgravity. And I hope I'm doing your work justice, Sans, but I think what's particular about this project is that it deals with the physical realities of being in space and produces an artifact that responds to that very particular experience and communicates the particularities through music. And so what you have is a kind of interfacing of the realities of space travel and an artistic perspective and an artistic transformation going on. And that is a really, I think, a powerful example of where you can create a shift in perspectives or increase the diversity of perspectives, because as we've been talking about so far, we're so far kind of dealing, in our understanding of outer space in the wider sense, we can rely on the stories of the Apollo program, where the moon is dead boring and subject to a very particular set of mission protocols, or we have the Western frontier colonial narratives, which are often repeated to try and help make space meaningful and understandable. That's not across every culture and every society, but it's certainly prevalent in let's say, Western-centric space industry. So there's a gap going on, I think, which is between the realities of outer space and the outer spaces we can imagine. And that's actually not my, that's not coming from me specifically, that's really borrowing from these two sociologists called Peter Dickens and James Ormrod, who I can send a link in the chat. But this gap between real space, imagined space, there's a huge, and it's widening, this gap. And I think that's a space that, as artists, designers, others can intervene in more interesting ways.
Yeah, we're living in the crisis of imagination. And specifically talking about this public or social imagination of outer space is now being either scientific, technologized, techie, or it is being monopolized by billionaires. If you're looking deeper into the visionary strategies of Bezos or Elon Musk, you would see that they spend quite a substantial amount of money into making visions or whatever, Mars, trip to Mars or lunar base or whatever, but we spend so much money into making it look nice, mostly romanticized or referring to those old ideas of the 70s. But they are interested not much into imagining something, imagining the future, but rather creating kind of make-believe or pretend that they are ahead of the time. They are those true futurists in such a way that it would intoxicate the public imagination, but everybody would think of it as those guys who own the future. In order to basically to pitch their other strategies. It's nothing new. General Motors did that and other companies, but it's becoming quite an issue here when you think of this public imagination of space flight or outer space in general. And referring to this technologized imagination of outer space, I would specifically refer to Lisa Messeri. I think you had her at one of the chats, anthropologist, astroanthropologist. Lisa Messeri. She specifically spent quite a lot of time and kind of did ethnographic research into how outer space is being visualized by various means of expression. Also how it is vocalized or put into words as kind of sonographical tools that allow us to, us experts, scientists, the public, to imagine outer space in a kind of affluent way, or kind of, as well, in her words, making outer space as a place. So in a way, it is already a kind of unique kind of means of art that turns outer space to some kind of narrative. But when you look deeper into that, it's really techie. It's really based on a geeky kind of vocabulary. So this is another issue of this current imagination crisis. Yeah, so
imagination crisis is capitalized on as a marketing opportunity, basically.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if you reframe everything that we've already done, for example, Apollo program, if you look into what kind of benefit it gave, it's actually nothing much. It was quite on the other hand, it was quite poetic. Especially what was Apollo 11, the one that brought us for the very first time on the moon. I don't remember that number, but anyway, if you look into a very, very idea of this program, there's little that human race had a benefit. So it might be considered as a kind of unique kind of poetic trip. Already piece of art, performative art, the most complicated that we ever did.
Just to back you up, obviously I'm an American, so like Apollo 11 is like extremely instantiated in my sort of like imaginary zeal for the future. But in terms of this like poetic thing, can you imagine being the first person on the moon and to retain such poise as to say what Neil Armstrong said, stepping upon the moon for the first time? And it wasn't anything beyond a sort of like embrace of all of humanity, right? One step for man, giant step for mankind, right? Leap, excuse me. So it is poetic. I think it was first of all, it was an engineering feat. Second of all, arguably, it was a sort of militaristic posturing against the USSR. Third, it was a poetic attempt to express like humanity's capability in this larger space that we occupy. I think that we, because we're earthbound and we reflect so much about our experiences, forget that we too, our little planet is floating in the same space as everything else. So I do think that it was largely an artistic endeavor. And I think I'm really glad that you framed it in that way, because a lot of people make that severance and it doesn't deserve to be made in that way.
Yeah, and if there is no neutral art, it's always politicized. It always has all kind of social layers and complications that you cannot have art that is neutral. So okay, it was militarized. Okay, it was,
otherwise it's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
This actually makes me think about one part that maybe we haven't necessarily, we haven't necessarily addressed, or as part of the, I stopped following the roadmap. I'm so into your conversation, and it's all very, very fascinating. But one part that I thought was an interesting thing, I think it's also coming from Tamara Alvarez, which was talking about this idea of, obviously the idea of planetary consciousness in sorts of, is this the ability, as Caitlin was mentioning, about like realizing that you are actually also on your little own planet, and this kind of idea of spaceship Earth and thing. Would this actually relationship between, or this kind of trying to imagination of different locations and lands and people and rituals and etc., would that increase some sort of like planetary consciousness, in the sense of like you realize that you part of a system that is bigger than yourself, because you know that you are part of a spacefaring sort of civilization in some ways? Or yeah, I don't know. It's not really a question. It's more of a general comment or open question in general.
We need some energy. No, I'm running out. No, I think it goes back to some things we've already talked about in terms of, you know, that relation between Earth and the Moon, and whether, and also humans' relationship to Earth itself, and is the Moon, as the case of the scenario that we were kind of briefed with, a kind of an escape valve in a way, or a kind of way in which we can address earthbound problems, or is it a stepping stone to Mars? And I think each of those scenarios or kind of premises will reframe how we think about these planets or these celestial bodies. Are they stepping stones, resources, homes, origin points, as Jeff Bezos again likes to make out? You can tell I've spent too much of my time looking at Jeff Bezos's work.
You're a fan.
Disclaimer. No, I'm not. That's the opposite.
Totally.
It's the irony. It's the irony. I'm not a fan at all. No.
Just joking. Just joking.
So, all to say again, it's complicated.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Andrew.
No, I was just going to say, I think that this point of framing the Moon and how we look at it really taps back into even beyond travel to it, kind of cultural folklore and the idea of this celestial body having a sway over our body, or the body, the tides, or the much bigger system, basically. And the imaginary going beyond the kind of scientific or future imaginary to where we're actually kind of contextualizing the whole endeavor, basically. Sitraka, what, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, so what I was about to propose actually is like take the next 10 minutes potentially as a way of like, not necessarily creating a conclusion about this conversation, but if there is potential things that you panelists wanted to talk about and didn't necessarily something that we didn't necessarily address, or maybe something that we addressed but you want to expand on. Maybe we can take the next like 10-15 minutes to to
an
discuss
opportunity
this.
to bring those points out to the floor, basically, and kind of things we wanted to get off our chest, or just yeah, kind of raise at this point. Or we should all raise a glass of Astro vodka whilst shaving our incredibly furry body. Joe's is already on it. It's not a cup of tea, it's a cup of Astro vodka.
I need it.
I'd like to make a point, and this, I don't know if this is unpopular, it seems like somewhat controversial lately, but I've been having conversations with people in my community about, you know, how life has evolved to this particular version, which is the human, and how and there's this kind of popular argument when we think about billionaires going into space and destroying our planet to do so, and the way that we're destroying our planet in our kind of occupation of it, and you know, the moon as an escape hatch, etc. There's this sort of like notion that humans are this kind of malignant species, and we should be kind of self-critical about that. But I want to argue the opposite, especially when we think about a future on a lunar base and like what that does for the future of life. It's kind of extraordinary to me, however life came about, that it has evolved in this particular kind of Darwinian way to such a degree as to produce just alarming and extraordinary biodiversity on our own planet, and to culminate in the existence of a species like ours that is reflective and exploratory to such a degree as to desire to go beyond our planet, which, as far as we know, no other species has done, and technologically to create the capacity to do so. And so something about Mare Nectaris and future space exploration, I think, is like maybe one of the most beautiful things that life could ever possibly do. And I'm just like, I want to be cautious about the way that we do it, but I'm just really inspired by the fact that we are, because it is kind of singular and spectacular. And, you know, bad as we are, I don't know that we're all that bad if we're taking this upon ourselves in a hopefully meaningful and applicable, like beneficially applicable way. So I want to counter the very popular human malignancy argument that goes about quite often when we talk about space. Joseph.
No, that was a great starting point for this section, and I think it ties into the things that I found most interesting about the conversation, or at least some of them. What we talked about earlier on about this idea of the kind of the language and the vocabulary of a lunar denizen, and what kind of psychological effects and experiences might become cultural artifacts or rituals, and this what I'm trying to get at is that whereas there might not be a I don't want to paint human beings in a negative light. I think it's more that the capacity to imagine in relation to outer space is a radically different context for us to respond to evolve, to create. That's the issue, I think. And so I think what we've touched upon today, yeah, it scratches the surface of the potential for imagining things differently. And I think there's an exciting potential there, which I think is so far not untapped, but yet to be fully realized for sure. I think we've touched upon some interesting projects today, which lead on to that. For example, the astrobotany, the Telematron from SANS. There are lots of things which really embrace the particularities of outer space and what it means for human culture, for human experiences, and then, of course, those implications for how we reflect upon our life here on Earth, going back to estrangement again. So I think that's what I'd like to raise, is that there's a real potential there. There's a radical context that can be explored and responded to, that we are only just beginning to do. And I look forward to seeing how we approach that.
Speak to Jeff, he's got some ideas, I imagine. Sorry.
Thanks, Andrew. You're the headless ghost haunting this conversation. That's great.
Popping up there. And any other thoughts from other panelists, or kind of?
I was just going to say, not in defense of Jeff Bezos at all, but like I think all space programs spend a lot of time on image making and propaganda. Like, it's not just about space and science and exploration, and even the thing that Neil Armstrong said when he landed on the moon, like everything's so carefully PR'd. I mean, my favorite, I think there was a Russian cosmology exhibition at the Science Museum a few years ago, where they showed that the Russian space mission, all the posters, they had that rocket shape on them, and that was just to confuse the American space effort into thinking that that's what the shape of the rocket was that they were planning, when actually obviously it was Sputnik. And I just love that. I just love that somebody took that step, like in the Russian space mission, to say, right, let's fuck with them. Let's pretend we've got a rocket when we've actually got like a sphere, or it is a rocket, sorry, but let's pretend we have this cylindrical shape rather than a sphere. And all those tiny little things I thought about, and like however much, like Joseph's obviously, like, you know, he's an incredibly critical mind and he's thought about it a lot. Like there are 1,000 people to every Joseph who are just going to see that one image and like react to that image and not think about the rest of the context. So I think that is something that we probably have to talk about and think about as well, that it's not just going to be brilliant Joseph Poppers around wondering what we got up to when we were on the moon. A lot of people are just going to see that snapshot on the front page of the newspaper and they're going to make a judgment based on that one image.
Absolutely.
In marketing, it is called vaporware. I don't know if you heard this term.
I haven't heard that.
This is where the term for vaporwave came from. Vaporwave as a specific genre of music. Vaporware, I think it was coined by Microsoft scientists who don't know what I think it was 80s. It was just few months of different kind of ads that they came up with, where they showed very futuristic kind of supercomputers that we actually didn't do anything with them. It was just images of, I think it was quantum computers, and we presented them as something that they are working on. It was both for addressed to experts as well as to the wider public, so that they had this strategy of deceiving their rival companies, as well as presenting themselves as something that, you know, very, very brave and very, very far oriented, or kind of future oriented. But actually everything was just a fake narrative. This is where this vaporware term came from. And yeah, but we've got lots of vaporware now. It is not just Russians who came up with these deceptive rockets. Yeah, but also it could be used for the good. to put the public into this different kind of imaginary realities in which space programs could be very different.
Andrew, you wanted to say something? Or not? Anyway, anyone else? Any other last thoughts before we wrap up? Or
well, I would say that it becomes not just complicated but impossible to talk when you think of so-called cosmic pessimism or kind of nihilistic approach toward cosmos. You know, cosmos is indifferent. You know, the universe, it doesn't matter whatever you do, whatever you think of, just nothing matters. And if you want really to empathize with a universal, the universal, just, you know, you just need to be silent and do nothing.
This is what we're going to do for the last 5 minutes.
Perfect way to spend time up on the moon bay, contemplating.
Oh, I have a suggestion.
Safely.
There is a specific contemplative technique called Gertes Meditation. It has a little bit to do with certain philosophical tools. One of most known probably is bracketing, a phenomenological tool. But I wouldn't go deep into that. I would tell you how to do it. It's kind of performative contemplative technique. You sit against something that you study, that you want to delve into, or want to empathize with. Or it might be something that you're really researching something. But so you have to put yourself in close proximity to that object and just sit and do nothing for an hour, for a week, or for a year, just sitting in front of that object. And that's it. You would be very different. And you would have a very specific knowledge of that object just by being in close proximity for a substantial amount of time. So what we need to do, just look at the moon for a year, for two, for a lifetime kind of observation. And that's it. Okay, I'm silent now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just gonna, well, thank you. Unless someone has a last comment, but I'm just gonna wrap this up. You're all cool. Joseph, you look like you want to say something. No, I'm joking. So I know that Sans actually mentioned something about what Nicolas de Montchort actually said last time during the Moon Life event. And I think he said something like, everything we do in space is about Earth. So for us, it was like, this is something that we thought was that we wanted to finish on, or somehow find a way of finish on that, because it's very kind of similar to, in some ways, the approach that we do with Very, Very Far Away. So whether you kind of like speculate on the moon's potential for resources extraction, or the use of design and implementation of a speculative moon base like Mare Nectaris as a strategy and opportunity to reimagine like the theme of this Biennale, the way we want to live together. I guess with these series of events, we were kind of interested with these series, we were kind of interested in reframing or sort of repositioning the human experience within the broader spacelight narratives. And I think this is what we've kind of like our guest done brilliantly throughout these events. And I really, really thank you for that. So even though this is the end of the Lunar Denizens series, I think it's also kind of like the beginning, because there's so many interesting conversational thoughts and comments and things that came out of these series, but I think it's also the beginning of something else or something new. So we're going to spend a little bit of time basically re-listen to all these events and compiling all interesting ideas and thoughts together in ways that can be shared and disseminated. So I would say, please, for the audience and everyone, the participants and the organizers and everyone, please keep in touch together and with us as well, whether it's like Instagram, Twitter, what have you, etc., etc. So I think we will have something coming up soon where we manage to share or disseminate some of these ideas and comments we had so far. But yeah, thanks again for the audience who joined us. That's always very good. The chat is always super interesting. Thanks again for Charmian, Caitlin, Julijonas, and Joseph for participating, because this was a real sort of privilege to be part of this and to be able to be given the opportunity to create these working groups as well with you, and the fact that you accept is like amazing. And I would like also to personally thank Nick Travaglini, sorry for pronunciation of your name, and Caitlin McShea, because obviously you definitely part of like you're the people who enabled this amazing collaboration and this series of events to happen. So thank you very much. And yeah, that is great. That's my bit.
Very excited to get home.
Thank you so much.
Thank everybody for your getting involved. Yeah.
Yes, thank you to Very, Very Far Away. Thank you to the Santa Fe Institute's Interplanetary Project, to all of our participants today and in the previous sessions, and also to all of my peers and colleagues in NSPDOS who have put in a lot of work behind the scenes to help make this possible. Really appreciate it. Thank you, finally, last but not least, to everyone who attended this event and all of the previous events. Please look out for this. We'll post it on social media and on our YouTube channel, the recording of this. And as Sitraka said, this is the beginning of a conversation. Humans are going into space and will continue to do so. And we are going to continue to think and talk about this stuff. So please get involved. Please stay involved in the space conversation. And we'll see you out there in the stars. Have a good day.